Haven't started yet. I can start now? All right, we're going to go ahead and get started then. Okay, so I'm Phil Spokas, VP of Professional Services at IntelliTect. I'm going to do a quick run through of Azure Services, or some Azure Services, some select Azure Services. I do a bunch of stuff. I don't really remember all the things I do, but recently, as Mark alluded to earlier, I've been doing a lot of Azure DevOps. So a question or two for the crowd here. How many people have not heard of Azure? Show of hands. Okay, as I expected. How many people have heard of Azure DevOps? Who has not heard of Azure DevOps? There's a couple, all right. Have you heard of Team Foundation Server? Azure DevOps is the cloud version of Team Foundation Server. I've been going around the country for Microsoft doing DevOps engagements. Okay, next question. How many people are aware that Azure DevOps could deploy to Amazon Web Services or Google? Wow, it can. One of the major clients that we have this year is deploying heavy deployment of Amazon Web Services using Azure DevOps. So blame Microsoft for crazy names. So the other thing that I'm going to say here is I'm going to try not to talk about DevOps anymore. We're going to talk about Azure and Visual Studio. I think everybody has heard of Azure. Everybody gets an idea of what Azure is. It's really kind of astounding, the numbers. So next question: how many people are using Azure today? Am I in my boundaries? I'm just realizing, oh crap, I'm being squeezed. There should be tape like down here. All right, so how many people are using Azure Services today? All the time? Every minute? Are you doing anything that's not on Azure? Yeah, well, I know where you work. It's nothing personal. I mean, it's. All right, so there's other people who didn't have their hands up. Are you using other cloud providers, or are you on-prem? Or are you not doing any development? They're not answering the question. All right, I'm done asking questions. We're going to go through some services. So, Azure is big. It's amazing. There's a ton of stuff out there. It's hard to keep up with the services that are available. I'm going to do a quick run through of some serverless functionality, concentrating on demos, and touching a little bit on some of the new capabilities in those serverless functions. Doing 40 minutes or 50 minutes or however long I actually take here on Azure is pretty hard. You really have to neck things down. Any topic could be, half a day easily or longer. So today what we're going to focus on is some serverless features and Visual Studio, operating things from Visual Studio 2019, not from Azure DevOps. I've been kind of like, oh geez, I should be doing this, I should be DevOpsifying this, but not DevOpsifying anything, just using Visual Studio 2019 client, and we'll go from there. Note that as we were discussing here, there are other providers out there. The thing to think about with Azure, Amazon Web Services, what do they do? What is Amazon? What is Amazon's primary mission in life? They deliver stuff. They're an e-commerce company. How about Google? What is Google's primary business? 90x%, some crazy high number. Unfortunately, I shouldn't have asked you questions because I can't hear. Advertising, right? I think that's pretty much what we said. That's 90x%, 98% or something of their revenue is advertising. Oracle apparently says cloud because they have to. And then one thing I've heard from somebody, it might have been an IBM salesman, IBM has the biggest cloud in the world. Maybe that's for mainframes or something. They're actually providing cloud services for mainframes, which is a big business for them, really. And it makes sense, right? I mean, legacy companies still on IBM mainframes. They don't want to host the hardware anymore. Let IBM do the hosting, and we'll pay them until we can finally migrate all our apps off of mainframe onto something more modern. Okay. Rolling on. So again, Azure Services, Visual Studio 2019. Visual Studio has pretty extensive support for Azure, and you can do quite a few things without ever leaving the comforts of Visual Studio 2019. A lot of the new stuff that's been coming from Microsoft in the area of Azure, some of the extended services, a lot of times there will be add-ons and extensions that you can get to from Visual Studio 2019. They're also investing heavily in command line driven provisioning and infrastructure as code. So infrastructure as code, is that a new term for people? Everybody kind of gets it, right? So we talk about deployments and automating deployments. Well, the next wave and a lot of what we're doing and a lot of what we're working on is automating the deployment of infrastructure as well, spinning up services. Could be on-prem, but a lot of times we're spinning up cloud services, then deploying bits on top of those cloud services. And that was sort of DevOps. So maybe that still won't be the last time I say DevOps in this talk, but I'm going to try hard not to say it anymore. With that, we are going to switch to, oh no, not yet, we're going to talk about serverless. So this is a diagram, not of what I'm going to show today, but it's some, Azure services and boxes and arrows and that sort of thing, and then we'll revisit it at the end. We're going to talk about Azure Service Bus, Azure Function apps, Azure Logic apps, quick little view into an Azure App Service. Maybe we'll do some debugging and talk about Azure App Insights. All right, so is anybody, I'm not going to ask any more questions. We're going to keep moving on. So I'm going to do a quick demo. We'll do of each of these things, wrap it up at the end. The code is not sophisticated. It's very simple. It's demo-worthy code, but still interesting, and hopefully we'll give you some ideas about what's going on in the world of Azure these days. So the first thing I want to talk about is Azure Service Bus, and we're going to bring up the new edge, some instance of the new edge. Which one do I want? Should have been, let's see, this one? Yeah, sure, we'll bring up this one. If you've used Azure at all, these windows are going to look somewhat familiar. I've got a bunch of resources in a VS 2019 demo resource group, and we'll hit some of these resources as we go along. So Azure Service Bus. Azure Service Bus is a cloud-hosted, publish-subscribe mechanism that lives in Azure. Go ahead. It depends on who you ask. No is the short answer. It is a component, or if you're a cloud version of BizTalk, that would be one piece of many that you would need to pull together to replace BizTalk. It's a PubSub component. It does do. It will reach out to on-prem. It has its own cloud-based API, right? We're making HTTP calls back and forth to talk to this thing. Includes security, includes scalability. Obviously, everything you say about Azure, a lot of the trick here is it's scalable, and it's scalable by me just asking for more resources or paying for more resources from Azure. I don't have to provision my own VMs to build things out. There's a couple of other things. Actually, I'm not going to talk about them today necessarily, but there's other components that you really need to glue together to if you're going to replace something like BizTalk. If you talk to Microsoft, you talk about a cloud-based integration architecture, they're going to talk to you about Service Bus, Logic apps, Function apps, and and a few other things. They're going to leave off some of the standard adapters that have been built up over time. They're going to leave off orchestration, and again, there are other technologies out there that will offset it. And I'm, there's a couple of biz talkers, maybe ex-big biz talkers in the crowd. So pipe up as you see fit. So PubSub. So this does support transactions, and it is platform independent to an extent, right? This is cloud hosted. So when I publish a message, it's going to be maintained in Azure. When I consume a message, it's maintained in Azure. But there's really I don't have to write a C# app to talk to this, right? I can write anything that can talk to HTTP endpoints, can publish messages, and there's standard libraries that are available for a number of different platforms. The code itself looks pretty straightforward, looks pretty simple. And again, not sophisticated code. It's just an idea to give you, excuse me, while I bring up the right version of Visual Studio. Or any version of Visual Studio. I'm sorry? Can you flip to the light contrast color? We don't have a screen. Okay. Control. Wow. Increase your font size. Yes. Where are we going here? The bottom left, 100%. Top of it, right there. How's that? I don't even need my glasses anymore. This is awesome. I should do this. I should work like this. Okay, so Azure Service Bus. As I said, this code is pretty simplistic. Look, there's a connection string very hard-coded into the code. Don't ever do that. I think I just said this last week to somebody. That should be in a key store and should be put into your pipeline when you do the deployment. But I'm not talking about DevOps, so forget I said that. I have a demo topic. I have a client, and I'm doing some async calls to pump messages into a queue. So some very simple code. This just sends 10 or so messages. We instantiated a client. Let me just go through that a little bit slower. So I've got a topic client provided by SDK, the Azure SDK. I then have I'm creating a topic client using the connection string, so connecting me to Azure, right? And then I've got a wrapper to send a message async, and here I'm just sending it 10 times, creating a new message, and then awaiting a send async. All right, fairly straightforward code, makes sense? Okay. There's receive code for this as well, but it's pretty much looks the same except for it's receiving. Let's take a quick look at that. And then there's my send, here's my receive. This app is just a .NET Core console app. So receive is pretty much the same. Code is pretty simple. Not sure why I put a breakpoint in there. Oh, to check my arguments. For a little bit later, I'm going to actually parameterize this and send a topic and a subscription. Don't tell some of the people in the room that I didn't use the system command line library to do my parameters. I'm really sorry. Other people can talk about that later. Yeah, I know. I got booze. People are going to start throwing rotten vegetables at me. So I'm sitting here awaiting results from my async call and my main async. I'm registering an event handler, so when something gets put on a queue, I'm going to get notified. Or I'm sorry, gets put onto the bus, I'm going to get notified. So I've registered that handler. When stuff comes in, I process the message and I just write out command line. Again, this is pretty simple stuff, straight off of the website. The point here is not to illustrate my extensive coding skills. So I'm going to just leave that there. Yeah, thanks. There you go. Straight man. So in theory, I've got a command here where I'm going to, let's see, just make sure I am where I am. All right, so if hopefully that's at least somewhat visible. Do I need to change my PowerShell window as well? We're not going to be spending that much time here, but to let me know if we do. So this is my send event. If I do .NET run from here, I could also run this from Visual Studio, but hey, whatever. All right, so I'm pumping 10 messages in. If we go back to the Service Bus, again, this is the Azure server side representation. Is that visible? We need to pump that up a little bit. What we're seeing here, my default view, my Service Bus namespace. The namespace, again, is just an addressable namespace, a virtual container for where my Service Bus lives and where queues and topics are going to live. I have security around this, shared access policies. I need to have secure strings in order to access this. One of them you saw buried in my code. If I was going to actually consume this in a real world scenario, that probably goes into a key vault. And in fact, one of the demos I have later actually pulls the connection string out of an Azure key vault. Again, I've got ability to geo-replicate. Obviously don't need to do anything that sophisticated here. I have the ability to do queues, so first in, first out queuing mechanism, and I can also do topics. Topics allow me to get a little bit more sophisticated with the messaging architecture or the approach that I'm going to take. For purposes of today, I just created two topics, one for demo, one for location. The first one we're going to look at is demo. This topic has had a bunch of messages pumped through it in spite of what those current messages say. And I have 3 different subscriptions here. That's why I use the mouse, so I don't press accidentally. What's interesting about this is I have one app that pushed messages to the bus, and I created 3 different subscriptions for 3 different reasons. The first one that I've got is just called Demo Sub 1. So if I go to my other app here and I just say, hey, receive read messages. Come on, enter key, work. Thank you. It's going to flush all the messages out of that queue. So that was the C# code that we just looked at. Read, write on one end, read on the other end. Okay. I go back and take a look, and we do a quick little refresh here, and we're going to see that there's 0 messages. Note that demo sub 2 and demo sub 3 are already empty. That's because there's logic apps that are triggering on messages arriving in those subscriptions, and then it's doing semi-interesting things with those messages. Okay? So far, so good. I'm going to keep rolling. Erin, graciously told me I had plenty of time, but I don't think she was serious. Yeah. So I'm going to keep moving. And again, throw out questions. Let's have the discussion as needed to make sure this is clear. So the next thing I'm going to bop to is really a Azure Functions. So Azure Functions, again, how many people have heard of Azure Functions? How many people are using Azure Functions? Cool, they're cool things. With a lot of these things, this demo of Service Bus and writing this application was very simple, right? I didn't need a degree in architecture to figure this stuff out. It's very accessible. If you know it's there, you have a simple scenario that needs it. You don't have to write a big application to leverage these services. You can do something simple and small and get something very sophisticated out the door pretty quickly. So keep that in mind as you're pulling these things together. Now, be forewarned a little bit as well, because this stuff is so easy. If you're not careful and not thinking ahead, you're going to end up with service sprawl and a whole bunch of things that you're not going to be able to manage. And there are other services out there that will help you out when you have a big ticket enterprise architecture that you need to deal with. Okay, so I'm going to go to the function app, and we don't care about the README, handy little keys and such in case I need them. And again, this demo function is incredibly simple. It's basically a HTTP request. This is the, I know how to do that. I did know how to do that. It's just been a while. 150, is that what we decided? Is that good? So again, this is pretty much straight out of the Azure documentation, simple sample demo Azure function, okay? Nothing to it. It is a hello function. It handles gets and posts. It processes name out of the query string. And then it drops hello plus the name into the result or the response, okay, with the return. As long as the name isn't null, it's going to return a response saying hello, whatever you say, and it's going to, if I didn't pass in a name, it's going to give me a bad request. Nice thing about Azure Functions, again, this is simple functionality, and I can run and debug this locally. The Service Bus itself doesn't really make sense to run locally. But Azure Function, even though it's serverless and hosted by Microsoft, when you run it, there is a client-side emulator that you can run to test your function out. And here it's firing up the emulator, and because it's a demo, it's going to take longer than it normally does. But trust me, I'm going to get a local web instance of this that I'm going to be able to execute my hello function against. So let's just go ahead and grab this guy. There's my local host. And we'll fire up, who should we fire up today? Firefox. Never IE. Don't ever use IE again. But you all knew that already. So yeah, please pass the name in the query string. That's what it says, trust me. And if I say name equal Fred, say hello Fred. Okay, pretty simple, right? I'm going to save you a little time. I put the cake in the oven, shocking, I know, and it's already hosted on Azure, so I'm not going to bore you with doing the deployment, which might take a few minutes.
What is the life cycle of Azure function? Is it all in request scope? Is everything static?
Dynamic, so it's spinning this up as it needs it, and it's destroying it after some period of time, not clearly defined, right? So you're getting the request, you're doing something with that request. You only get so many minutes as well with an Azure function. So thank you for the question, because it reminds me to tell you, it's a function. It's not an application. So you do have to be careful with threading and managing state, right? And if you're, depending on the resources that you are using, you'll need to lock them and protect them so they don't get, you're not trashing yourself, okay? Let's see, who was the last person on the team? He's not here right now, but I'll give you a reference, and he can tell you horror stories about, again, no, it's not Kelly. Jason, I think. If, again, other people have probably run into as well. So be careful with the resources. Now, the other interesting thing about Azure Functions, so out of the box, the consumption model is, I'm only going to charge you, Azure says, I'm only going to charge you when you actually use the thing, and you get a lot of invocations and a lot of CPU time just built into it. So it's, more or less a free service. So if you're doing something pretty simple, hey, it's cheap and it's cheap and easy. You want something more sophisticated, start thinking about other approaches to your problem. There is a premium model as well, where premium, you get to pay more, but you get more services, more stickiness, and startup time. So think about this. When somebody hits this HTTP request, if my function isn't alive, Azure's got to go grab a VM, spin it up, initialize it, load my code, and run it. It's fairly quick, seconds, multiple seconds, but it's not immediate.
What would you think about using Azure Functions as an alternative to a web API?
Is Steve Byerly here? No. All right. So I can say whatever I want. I'd be careful. I would say yes for sure, but again, the name connotes, like, say, how far you would want to go with it, right? So I think you can if you've got a simple API, you're using it occasionally, you expect the requests to be short-lived, don't really have to do much, then it makes a ton of sense, right? It's what the service is there for. Additionally, we talked about premium. There's also, you can also deploy your function inside of an app service. So we haven't talked about app services yet, but it's basically hosted web apps similar to other. I thought you said like I got like a foot, no? Perry, no, don't go past Perry. How about if I move Perry over a foot? So you can deploy the function into app service, so you get the benefit of the model, and you get the benefit of fixed resources for your function. You're paying more for it that way. You're paying app service prices. We have deployed functions within app services where we were already deploying a web app that had to be up all the time, or has to be up all the time, and we add a function or two into that app service, and it's running in shared space inside that app service. Again, when you deploy an app service, a web app, you're provisioning a fixed or committed to resources under the covers. It's not always a VM; it's a shared VM, right? If you're doing premium plans, you're getting more dedicated virtual machines. The other recently, Microsoft also introduced durable functions. So further complicating my answer to your question of should I use it for a web API? Sure, why not? What the heck? Maybe is the real answer. Durable functions will actually maintain state from invocation to invocation to invocation. So in a classic sense, Azure Function, these are designed to be stateless. You spin them up, you need state, you better go get it because when you die, it's gone. Durable functions actually allow you to define some durable state that can be passed to further function invocations. Going back to the whole BizTalk thing, now allows me to orchestrate an event stream or something like that, right? So I'm doing some processing. I got to do this to it. I got to do that to it. I got to do this other thing to it, and I want to split that up into functions. So that is a capability. All right, so we took a quick look at the code. I run and debug locally. I can also go into Visual Studio and let me stop this guy. And don't ever do this, says the DevOps guy. Right-click Publish. But again, you're in a development environment, you're testing stuff out, playing with it, right-click Publish, but as soon as you have something real, put it into a pipeline of some sort and publish it from there. So we talked about some of the new features. In the interest of time, I think I'm going to just keep rolling here. This is the deployed app. Some of the nice things about this function, again, it was incredibly sophisticated code. So believe me when I say it runs. But there is a nice little runner up here. So, which is now over here, given my screen resolution. I put in a name and I say whatevs, and then I scroll back over here and I hit run. Actually, I swear I keep doing this and it just keeps coming back. I don't know. Hit run, and I should get a request body of whatevs, but I'm not going to worry about it too much. Maybe I'm not hitting the button hard enough. So trust me, it works. We'll see that later. Okay, so quick run through Azure Functions. So far, so good. Yes, also VS Code, but again, today's topic is VS 2019. So a lot of these things can be done in VS Code. There's a number of extensions that are coming along, and sometimes making it a preferable environment depending on specifically what you're doing. So if you're doing lightweight web development, pushing out to web server, Visual VS 2019 is not required. Okay, so far so good. We're going to keep rolling. Next we have logic apps. So again, logic apps, heard of them, used them, heard of them, used them. So, a few people. They're very handy little things. So again, a serverless component. They are no code and fairly sophisticated. We can do quite a bit with it. What people who use logic apps sometimes don't realize is that you can actually, with extensions, the Azure SDK and logic app extension, I can actually go in and edit logic apps in Visual Studio. So again, a logic app is basically hosted orchestration, hosted step sequencing engine, workflow engine that Microsoft hosts in Azure. Have you heard of Microsoft Flow? Flow is, we've got one person who's heard of Flow. Flow is basically a wrapper on top of Azure Logic Apps, and it's part of Office 365, and it is the replacement for SharePoint workflows. I bet you didn't think I was going to say SharePoint today. But it's the replacement for SharePoint workflows. So, again, what can be done here is pretty crazy. There's a number of actions that can be taken within a flow. And basically, I'm taking actions. This is, no code or very little code, and I'm sequencing actions together. So I perform an action. I get some data from it. I pass it on to the next action. There's a number of different things that I can do. On and on and on and on, and there's stuff happening. Things are added to this on a fairly regular basis. I'm going to close this guy. In my particular scenario here, what I'm doing is remember my topic. Hopefully you guys are still awake. A few minutes ago I talked about Azure Service Bus and topics. And I had a topic name of demo, and I created a subscription, which I call Demo Sub 2. But basically this logic app is going to use that second demo subscription that I created to pull messages off of that queue. So this logic app is getting triggered whenever a message shows up on that queue. It then passes the data into an HTTP call. Guess what that HTTP call does? Calls my function and does some incredibly sophisticated processing on that message. Does anybody know what it does? Gives it hello, puts a hello in front of it. It doesn't really matter, right? The point is powerful, right? I can sequence these things in logic apps, and the first moment where things start to get a little bit, this is a no-code environment, I can do some parameter substitution and concatenation, and there's some built-in functions. But if I feel like I want to write code, no problem. Call out to an Azure function, right? And again, this is where that orchestration story starts to come into play. I'm then going to take that logic app, and I'm going to just put it back on the service bus. It could go anywhere. Put it back on the service bus, and I'm going to say, pass my request in and say that I've processed it. And so now I've got another message on the event queue, or the service bus, not on the queue. And this guy, actually it's in here somewhere, history. So if I run number 9 here, you may or may not be able to see that, but that's basically passing in location topic and location sub 1, which is just another topic that I've got. So it's now reading out messages that I put on that queue. Okay, so published the message, triggered in a logic app, did some processing on it, got the message back, and dropped it down into another queue. But there's lots of other things that could have been done here. Okay, send messages, receive messages, logic apps. There's a ton that can be explored here. In the interest of time, I'm going to keep rolling, right? Skimming over the top. All good? Azure App Service. Okay, who's deployed a web app to Azure? That's all we're doing here, web apps. So this is fairly straightforward. Let me open a project here. Demo web. This is a .NET Core app. Core 2. Simple Razor pages. Again, there isn't really anything very sophisticated about this application. Fairly standard web app. If I run this, I can run this on my local machine. I can also publish this to Azure, right, and have it hosted in Azure. So running locally, I have this connected to a simple SQL Server database. I'm running locally from Visual Studio. It's running local DB, or the local version of SQL Server. I've got home. Fun stuff is just around the corner. That's when Grant and Mark show up. But until then, you have to deal with it. And of course, for the first time in the last day and a half, I get an exception. But we're not gonna debug it now. I know why. Because I put a server-based fun little story. I put the Azure SQL. So I provisioned a SQL Server in Azure. To initialize it, I changed my local connection string so I could initialize the database, and I didn't change it back. When I did this, I was at home in my home office. Azure SQL has a nice little firewall around it, not allowing just any old IP to go talk to Azure SQL. The IP at home is not the same as the IP at the office. Okay, interesting little story. So. But of course, something was going to happen, right? So anyway, trust me, it works. We're going to keep moving. Hand wave. So what we'll do is bring up the deployed version. So this is that sophisticated app in Azure, and what I'm doing here is actually displaying messages. Some of these may or may not look familiar, as I actually have another logic app on the third topic, or the third, thank you, subscription. On the third subscription, which is reading the messages, triggering off of the message, and then inserting that message into SQL Server. Also, something else you probably don't really want to do in a production scenario is have your logic app writing to SQL Server, but hey, you can do it. So I did it. And so this web is displaying messages out of the database, which is written to by the logic app. Okay. Interesting things about applications, about this application, a couple of things. Logic app, again, sorry, going back a little bit. There's a nice web view of this. You get some default messages. You see something that doesn't succeed. I can quickly click into this and see what's wrong with it. There's also, I don't know if you remember that slide, second slide where I talked, there was $1 billion. That $1 billion is what Microsoft says they're spending annually on security. Annually on security. So you see that all over the place with, visibly in the API is also invisibly, right? Where they have perimeter protection and all the staff, every data center, just, you can imagine when you think about it, all the stuff that's going on. 54 regions. Well, each region is made up of at least 2 data centers, often more. All those have to be physically protected. Then you have all the network security that goes into it on top of the physical security. And then there's protection of these resources, right? Let's make sure that my fancy-dancy demo logic app doesn't get a DOS attack, right? So they've got that stuff built in, and that's a lot of the features and functions that we've been seeing in the last years. Last few years, a lot of bulking up of the security perimeter. Okay, moving on to demo web. Also intelligence, where so again, security. Security, I don't know, a couple years ago, an app service was, down below the fold, as they say. Now it's right up there at the top, right? They want you thinking about security all the time. Here's, apparently I did a pretty good job deploying this web app because it's not complaining to me about security or giving me alerts, but it's looking for them, right? And if it detects something wrong with my configuration, it's going to tell me about it, right? So this is a pretty cool feature that really helps when you're developing. One less thing to worry about. I think that's probably about it. Any other questions on app service, what I did there? Again, I just built the app locally, published it to Azure. And then SQL Server itself. So Azure SQL is the cloud-hosted version of Microsoft SQL Server. They continue to add features and functions to SQL. A while ago, they put in a number of security features around data protection, encryption at rest, data masking, and transparent data encryption. So my data is always going to be encrypted no matter where it goes, and as an admin, I can decide who's going to see data. If somebody has access to SQL Server, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to see the actual data. They have to have the right privilege or the right protection to see it. With some of the dynamic data masking, right? So if it's social security numbers, maybe I only see the last 4. I don't get to see the first 7 or whatever it is. And then again, always data security, especially with SQL Server, looking for vulnerabilities in my deployment. Another cool thing that I can do here is query right from the web. So I don't need to, whatever. Again, trust me, it works. in the interest of time, I'm going to keep going, and then I can also pull this up in and directly connect to that from Visual Studio as well, right? So I can manipulate, modify, query my database from Visual Studio 2019 connected to Azure SQL. Okay, last thing I want to show you. Another critical service that is incredibly easy to use that I recommend you do use, especially when deploying to Azure, is App Insights. So I configured my web app for App Insights by adding Application Insights. I basically hit a checkbox somewhere and said, yeah, I want Application Insights. And for that, I can do things like do a search for the last 24 hours and get a pretty rich stream of all the stuff that's been going on in my website. Again, I clicked a button and I hit deploy. That's all I did, and I'm getting very sophisticated eventing and analytics. Again, this is a big long demo all on its lonesome. So we're going to leave it alone. But this did come in handy earlier today because, of course, you noticed how I got the connection string wrong just a few minutes ago. Well, the reverse of that problem was not getting my database deployed correctly in the first place because EF migrations, which I ran, doesn't initialize your database by default. It'll upgrade your database, but it won't initialize it by default. So I just changed my connection string to be Azure SQL, set the firewall rule, and ran my initialized database migration, and bang zoom, I had a database created on Azure. So somewhere buried in here is my event that says, dude, you couldn't call SQL Server, and here's why. And actually, here's the 3 or 4 reasons why, because you can't fix the problem the first time. There's got to be the cascading effect of whatever other issues I had to get things right, getting the connection string in, and so on and so forth. Okay, Azure SQL. And a talk of Azure is not complete unless I say containers, Kubernetes, and microservices. Come on, FN, F5, there we go. So that is it from me. So you want to know more about Azure, azure.microsoft.com. Check out the blog. Just reading it, taking a few minutes to scan it every day or every other day or whatever, as much as you can take. You just see there's so much happening here, right? Microsoft is desperate to win the cloud war. Desperate. They don't win, they die. So they're, again, I think you can see over the last few years just the incredible progress that they've made. And, to Azure or to AWS's credit and to Google's credit and the other industry players are all competing against each other. We all benefit from that. And also, if a number of people didn't raise their hands when I said, have you used it? Go use it, right? There's a free tier. You get a bunch of free services. And marginally useful, but if you have Visual Studio subscription, that will come with a dollar amount that you can spend on a monthly basis to go play with this stuff. How'd that happen? Okay, any questions? Hopefully this was useful. Some food for thought, things to think about going forward. And where it made sense, it was all VS 2019 and Core 3. Note that Azure Functions does not yet support Core 3. It's very close. There's a preview, and you can reconfigure your Azure Functions environment to get it.
So Phil, if we were kind of working at a company trying to figure out, hey, what are the things that I should kind of be focusing on? When I'm looking at kind of my typical kind of business applications, I'm looking to integrate different things. I'm looking to maybe stand some services up. I'm looking to
So that's a challenging question because there's so much, but I think the sort of the way I would approach it is pick something, do something, and as small a unit as possible, right? So if you have an app, a web app, and it's standalone, even if it's only used internally, that's a great candidate, right? Or if there's minimal dependencies, that's what I would look at. If I have some processes that I'm running that maybe are automated with, Picket, a batch, batch script, Windows Commander, Picket, right? I mean, pick one of those off and say, look, I can run this in a Logic app. Okay, the Logic app doesn't quite cut it. I don't feel quite right about it. I can extend it with the Function app. I mean, I spent very little time putting this together, and the infrastructure is not really a barrier at all. It's very simple. It's very simple to get started. Grant, I don't know if that really answered the question or sort of. I mean, again, it's a tough one, right? It's always going to depend, but I think, force yourself to start simple and don't boil the ocean. Do something really simple, get it going, get people excited about it, and then let it build, right? Because theoretically, if you can get rid of Windows Commander or whatever crazy thing, deploying to a local app service from your desktop, don't ever do that. And also don't ever use IE ever again. That time that you're saving there, you can use to, re-engineer or reinvent the next process.
I'm curious, function looks very similar or essentially the same thing to the AWS Lambda
Yeah.
space.
Yes.
In the AWS Lambda space, it seems like the industry started to pick a preference to what they deploy. I'm curious, is there a preference? Does other industries have a preference for function yet?
I'm going to say it's likely C# because of the ecosystem. There are other options, but again, the question is there a preference in the Azure space for the tooling or the code platform, the implementation? Again, it's hard to say because we do Microsoft stuff mostly, and I'm seeing a lot of C#, but some Node, right, or some TypeScript. What's interesting is we have a project going on where we're doing AWS Lambdas, and that's Node. They're using Node. They made a decision to go Node. So you have some options there. I mean, it supports Python, it supports Node, C#, PowerShell. What's that? F#. So.
Back with Python, are you guys doing some stuff with like data science, like Databricks?
Yes. So actually, the diagram that I showed earlier was an initial prototype application that was using Azure Functions, Logic Apps, Data Factory, Data Lake, USQL. It was sort of the first generation. So USQL is, again, data mining, data aggregation, data processing. And the Gen 2 of that architecture is Databricks. So they're using runbooks, heavy Python, and converting what was in USQL into Databricks. And that's also an interesting DevOps challenge because you're spinning up VMs that support the Databricks, and you only want to spin them up when you need them because they're not cheap. So.
Are you familiar with what the policies are for substituting on-premise license fees like for SQL Server?
So you get credit. You can get credit for on-prem licenses. So the specifics of it, I don't know, but you don't. Generally speaking, like if I spin up Azure SQL, the licensing cost is basically rolled into the monthly. But they do have some discounting that's available if you're paying, let's say, enterprise SQL Server licenses. That's certainly true for VMs, where you can use your licensing credits for Windows and.
So if you have like a standard license that doesn't include things in SQL Server like
So I don't know if you know this about Microsoft, but they're willing to make deals. You didn't hear that from me, by the way. Nobody pays the list. Wait, did I say that out loud? I'm sorry. I'm not the RD, so I can say stuff like that.
We have time for one more question right now.
He would say it too. So
So we have time for one more quick question.
can I leave? That probably wasn't the question.
That was not the question.
Yeah, I was gonna whiteboard the what we just did, but I don't have time for that anymore. It's too bad. So how about if that's a quick question?
That can be a quick question. We can have 4 questions.
So hello, come on. Just default to writing. So I had a service bus. I had a little app. I wrote that onto the service bus. I had another little app that read stuff off the service bus. I then had this logic app thingy, which read stuff off the service bus, which called Azure Function. Those are braces. I'm not used to Kevin's mouse. I'm not used to his mouth either. Yikes. So that went like that, and that wrote onto another server. Well, it's actually the same service bus namespace. And then I had another logic app, which wrote to SQL Server database. And then I had a web app. Let's put that up here. That's not on the bus, sorry. I had another web app which read from the database and displayed a bunch of stuff on the page. I think that was it. Did I miss anything?
I didn't know you were proficient in same experience.
So I'm gonna blame the mouse. Okay. Cheers. Thank you, everybody.